In 2022, a man who had been absent for nearly 3 decades showed up at a stranger's door somewhere in rural Ohio. He had a wooden box with him. Inside that box were journals, circuit diagrams, damaged electronic components, photographs, and notes that seemed like they simply shouldn't exist. His name was Mike Marcum. The last time anybody had laid eyes on him was back in 1997, on the night he walked into a machine he had constructed inside his own garage and simply vanished. When investigators reached the property following the fire, the garage was already reduced to nothing, burned all the way down to its foundation. The concrete floor bore a 6-foot circular scar, blackened and oddly smooth, as though something had driven intense, concentrated heat into the ground from a single focus point. Copper wiring had melted directly into the concrete. Transformers had been completely destroyed. The metal framework of the machine had warped and fused together in ways that pointed to temperatures far exceeding anything a straightforward electrical fire could have generated. There was no body, no remains, no bone fragments, no dental evidence, no indication that Mike had simply walked away. No tire tracks, no footprints in the soft earth just outside the garage door. Only a single thing remained, a handwritten note tucked inside a metal toolbox, folded once, written in pencil on lined paper. It's not about time, it's about how you see things. For nearly 30 years, the world had simply assumed Mike Marcum had perished in that fire. A missing person report was submitted. The case eventually went cold. The story drifted away from local news and settled into the strange corners of the internet where unsolved disappearances and unexplained phenomena tend to gather, feeding off one another. But then he returned, older, hollowed out, worn down in a way that seemed to go beyond mere physical exhaustion. And he brought evidence with him. What he uncovered was not evidence of time travel. It was something far more unsettling, something that makes time travel seem almost straightforward by comparison. Because according to Mike, the machine never sent him backward or forward through time. It fundamentally altered his relationship with reality itself. And what he experienced during those missing years is the very reason this story needs to start at the moment he first encountered the thing he was never supposed to understand. The discovery. Mike Marcum did not emerge from any university setting. He had absolutely no government backing, no team of physicists reviewing his work and telling him when he had gone too far. He was a man who grew up in rural Missouri, carrying an obsession that had been with him since he was a child. Electricity. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Mike was exactly the kind of kid who took apart everything within reach. Radios, household appliances, motors, old television sets, anything housing a circuit board or a wound coil of wire. He pulled components from salvage yards, wore the pages of electronics books from the public library down to softness, and assembled machines in his parents' garage that crackled, hummed, and occasionally misfired dramatically enough to knock out the breakers throughout the entire house. To most people around him, it looked like a reckless pastime pursued by a boy with little grasp of the dangers involved. To Mike, though, electricity was a language. It communicated with him in ways that people simply never could. It was reliable. It operated by rules. And whenever he built something the right way, it responded with a precision that nothing else in his life had ever come close to matching. By the early 1990s, Mike was living by himself on a modest rural property in Missouri, picking up odd jobs here and there, and pouring every available hour into his garage, surrounded by salvaged gear, hand-drawn diagrams, and the layered remnants of a decade spent teaching himself electrical engineering. He held no degree, no formal credentials, no connection to any institution whatsoever. What he possessed was something close to an instinctive feel for electromagnetic fields, combined with a readiness to push his experiments well beyond the point where any formally trained physicist would have stepped back and asked for guidance. And sometime during the early 90s, working by himself in that garage, deep into the night, that invisible language responded to him in a way nobody had anticipated. He had assembled a Jacob's ladder, 2 metal rods arranged in a V shape carrying high voltage, with a bright electrical arc traveling upward before breaking apart and restarting from the bottom. Nothing exotic about the setup, the sort of apparatus you'd find in a classroom or a science demonstration. The kind of thing that shouldn't have produced anything more remarkable than a visual effect and that sharp, familiar bite of ozone in the air. But on one particular night, Mike introduced something out of the ordinary, a cheap laser pointer, the kind available at any electronics shop for just a couple of dollars. He lined up the beam so it passed straight through the climbing arc. It wasn't a calculated move, just an impulse. He was curious what coherent light would do when it crossed the ionized air channel the arc had created. At first, nothing appeared to change. The arc kept climbing. The laser beam cut through it. The garage was filled with the steady, familiar 60-cycle hum of high voltage running through the system. Then the sound began to shift. The electrical hum tightened, rising into a different pitch, sharper, more concentrated, as though the whole system had suddenly locked onto a resonance it hadn't been generating before. The arc steadied itself. Rather than climbing and collapsing in its usual rhythm, it drew inward, held its position, and began turning in a slow, deliberate spiral that Mike had never witnessed in any Jacob's ladder setup before. That's when he noticed the washer, a small steel washer resting on the workbench near the base of the apparatus, sitting inside what he would later describe as the field. For just a fraction of a second, it flickered, not moved, not pulled by magnetism, not shoved by air pressure. It was present. Then it wasn't. Then it was present once more, almost as though someone had cut a single frame from reality and stitched the footage back together. Mike forgot to breathe. He placed other objects near the rods, screws, coins, small fragments of metal. And every so often, when the laser angle, the voltage, and the arc configuration aligned in precisely the right combination, the object would disappear only for the briefest moment. No flash, no sound, no visible motion, just absence, a small hollow space where matter had existed. Then the object would come back, exactly where it had been, as if reality had quietly corrected itself and hoped nobody was paying attention. But Mike was paying attention. The air carried a sharp ozone scent, yet beneath that was something else entirely. Metallic, cold, something that made his skin pull tight and the hair along his arms stand up in a way that had nothing to do with static electricity. It felt biological. It felt as though his body was responding to something his mind hadn't yet caught up with. That was the night Mike Marcum's life divided into two distinct halves, everything before the field and everything after it. He had no idea what he had stumbled upon. He lacked the words to describe it and the technical background to properly examine it. But one thing he understood with complete certainty: it was real, and he needed another person to hear about it before he talked himself into believing he was coming apart. The call. In January of 1995, Mike Marcum reached out to Coast AM. That late-night radio program, hosted by Art Bell, had grown into a gathering point for the seemingly impossible. Strange vanishings, UFO encounters, covert government programs, fringe science, unexplained events. Art had listened to all of it. He was a sharp interviewer with a natural instinct for telling the genuine, apart from the theatrical. Over the years, Art had built a devoted listenership, people who trusted him to sort out which callers were genuinely worth their time. Mike didn't come across like someone performing for an audience. He sounded shaky, uncertain, like a man struggling to put words to something that still unsettled him deeply, something he hadn't quite made sense of yet, something he half expected would sound completely unhinged the moment he spoke it aloud to another person. Art nudged him gently, probing with care. Could it be some kind of visual trick? Could the arc be warping the surrounding air and producing an optical distortion? Could heat shimmer or some kind of ionization be causing objects to seem like they'd gone missing when really they were just being blocked from view? Mike's response shifted the entire mood of the conversation. He explained that he knew the objects were truly vanishing because he could physically sense the field the moment it switched on. Something changed inside the garage. The air grew heavy, thick, compressed in a way that had nothing to do with heat or moisture. The space itself seemed to hold its breath. Everything caught within the field's reach felt altered, slower, denser, as though the room had quietly slipped into a slightly different version of reality. Then he brought up the animals. His dog wanted absolutely nothing to do with the garage anymore, not only when experiments were running, but at any time whatsoever. The animal refused to cross the entrance, wouldn't step inside even when Mike physically carried him right up to the doorway. Birds stopped coming to rest on the roof. Insects steered clear of the interior entirely. Living creatures were responding to whatever was present in that space well before Mike himself had fully grasped what the field was actually doing. Art urged him to start documenting everything carefully. Find witnesses, capture video footage, write down the conditions, the voltage levels, the angles, the precise setup each and every time something disappeared, and stop approaching this like some personal hobby tucked away in a garage. It required proper oversight. It needed other people paying close attention, but Mike didn't pull back. Instead, he pushed further. Over the following year, the experiments became both riskier and far more ambitious in scope. Mike required substantially more power than his home's electrical supply could ever deliver. During the summer of 1995, he took 6 heavy-duty industrial transformers from a remote electrical substation and integrated them directly into his existing setup. The draw on the power supply was staggering. Lights flickered and dimmed at neighboring homes. A brownout rolled through the surrounding neighborhoods. As the local grid strained under the load Mike's equipment was pulling, utility workers followed the unusual surge straight back to his garage. He was taken into custody and faced charges of stealing utility infrastructure. 60 days in the county jail. For almost anyone else, that would have been the end of the whole affair. For Mike, it functioned more like an incubation period. He spent every day of that sentence sketching out circuit diagrams on any scrap of paper he could get his hands on, refining his layouts, turning over in his mind everything that had gone wrong and what might be done differently next time. He walked out of that jail sharper and more focused than when he had walked in. When he reached out to Art Bell again, Art could hear the shift right away. Mike was no longer buzzing with excitement. He was no longer the jittery hobbyist who had first called in, half spooked by his own findings. Now he sounded utterly consumed, relentlessly driven, and there was something else in his voice that Art struggled to put a name to. He sounded like someone who had simply stopped calculating the dangers, because the pull of what he was uncovering had grown stronger than any hesitation he could summon. Mike reported that the objects were no longer just briefly vanishing. They were remaining absent for several seconds at a stretch, and when they reappeared, something about them had occasionally changed. A wooden block disappeared for 3 full seconds. Upon returning, it was cold to the touch, nowhere near room temperature. Cold, as though it had passed through somewhere entirely different, somewhere with a distinct ambient temperature, and carried that chill back with it. A flower went missing and returned withered and desiccated, as though it had lost days of its life within just a few elapsed seconds. The petals had turned brittle. The stem was completely dried out. Whatever had happened to it during those 3 seconds, it had experienced the passage of time in a way entirely different from everything else in the room. Then came the moment that left Art Bell uncharacteristically silent for the first time during the whole conversation. Mike had run a test involving the field and a mouse. He placed the small creature inside a little cage within the field's range. The mouse disappeared for 5 seconds. When it came back, it was still alive, but something was clearly off. It moved in frantic circles inside the cage, throwing itself against the walls repeatedly, refusing food and water, showing a kind of wild, disoriented distress that Mike had never witnessed in any animal before. 2 days later, the mouse did not survive. Art told him he needed to stop right away. He needed actual scientists involved, proper oversight, people who genuinely understood what risks were at play here, not just to Mike himself, but to any living thing that entered that field. A silence settled over the line. Then Mike said he simply could not stop at this point. He was too far along, and what makes that so unsettling is that he was not wrong. He was close, just not to what he believed he was approaching: the disappearance. In late February of 1996, Mike made what would become his final known call to Coast AM before everything shifted. He said the field had expanded. It no longer only affected small objects placed directly at the center of the device. It had grown to the point where he could partially step into it himself. And when he did, time felt distorted. Everything beyond the field appeared to slow down. Motion seemed stretched. Sounds grew lower and drawn out. Colors appeared to drift toward the blue end of the spectrum. When he stepped back out, more time had elapsed in the garage than he had actually experienced while inside the field. Minutes unaccounted for, sometimes even longer stretches. Art asked the question that seemed obvious. Mike himself wasn't sure whether he had built a time machine or not. When pressed, he admitted he couldn't really say. Perhaps it was time being affected. Perhaps it was perception shifting. Perhaps reality itself was bending around the field in ways that the word time simply wasn't equipped to describe. But whatever the field was doing, it wasn't merely relocating objects from one place to another. It was fundamentally altering the way those objects existed. Art made another attempt to pull him back from the edge, to persuade him that he was in far deeper than he could handle. But by that point, Mike's paranoia had solidified into something closer to absolute conviction. He was sure people were keeping tabs on him. Unfamiliar cars kept showing up near the property. He was convinced the government had become aware of what he was constructing and was quietly deciding how to respond. The conversation ended with a promise from Mike. He would reach out again in March. He would come back with hard evidence, video footage, measurements, everything Art had been asking for. That call never happened. In March of 1997, Mike Marcum disappeared. His phone line went dead. Letters were returned, still sealed. The farmhouse looked as though no one had lived there in a long time. Then the garage caught fire. When investigators picked through what remained, they found pieces of the machine scattered through the wreckage. Melted copper, ruined transformers, scorch marks burned deep into the concrete floor. A circular burn pattern, roughly 6 feet across, sat at the very center of the floor. But there was no body, no remains, no answers, only a handwritten note left inside a toolbox. The official investigation led nowhere. A missing person report was filed, and in time the case quietly went cold. The story drifted away from the real world and settled entirely online, where Mike Marcum gradually became something of a legend. Then, in 1998, that legend took an even stranger turn. A researcher digging through old records online came across a newspaper clipping dated back to 1930. A body had been pulled from a California beach. Male, appearing to be in his early 30s, dressed in clothing that struck people at the time as oddly out of place for that era. In his pocket was a small rectangular metallic device covered in buttons and unusual markings that nobody could make sense of. Once the image spread across the internet, people noticed something deeply unsettling. The device resembled something a hobbyist experimenter from the 1990s might have cobbled together, a rough early prototype of some electronic instrument built decades before the required technology actually existed. Had Mike Marcum somehow ended up in 1930, passing away there long before he was ever born? There was no hard evidence, just a photograph, just a coincidence, just one more shadow clinging to a story already thick with them. Then, in September of 2006, the quiet broke in an unexpected way. Dr. Harold Putoff, a physics professor at a small university in Oregon, sat down at his desk on a Tuesday morning, opened his email, and went completely still. The sender field read Mike Marcum. The message itself was brief. Mike stated that people believed he was gone. He said that was not the case, though he also acknowledged he was not quite present in any ordinary sense. He included attachments for something he referred to as a third-generation vortex stabilization frame, urging Putoff to examine them rather than attempt to construct anything. What was attached went far beyond anything Mike had ever discussed in public. There were circuit layouts, field equations, cautions about physical harm from prolonged exposure, and detailed observations on neurological effects seen in test subjects, effects that closely mirrored what the mouse had experienced years before, yet described using far more advanced technical language than Mike had ever demonstrated during his radio appearances. Putoff attempted to respond. The message bounced back. He tracked it to a public library terminal in Kauai, Hawaii. Library staff had no memory of anyone fitting Mike's description. Another dead end. Another trace left behind by a man who seemed to exist only in scattered pieces. And then, 16 years on, Mike came back. Back in October 2022, Andrew and Melanie Carter were in the middle of renovating an old farmhouse out in rural Ohio. While pulling insulation away from the attic walls, Melanie's hand knocked against something firm tucked behind the framing. A wooden box, heavy, coated in dust, deliberately concealed somewhere. Nobody would stumble across it by accident. On its lid sat a faded, handwritten label, M. Marcum. Do not open until the right time. Inside were journals packed with notes, circuit diagrams, dates, and warnings spanning from 1995 all the way to 2021, 26 years worth of documentation, along with circuit boards sealed inside anti-static bags, and a Polaroid photograph showing a man standing next to a large, ring-shaped metal frame inside what looked like a basement workshop. The date printed on the photograph read June 21st, 2021. On the back, written in the same hand as the label, it did work, but not the way I thought it would. Then they came across something even harder to explain. One of those journals had the precise address of the farmhouse they currently owned written right inside it. Next to it, a note read, "Magnetic field stability, optimal safe storage location. They will find it when the time is right." They shared the discovery online, and the story moved quickly. People who had been following the Marcum case for decades started reaching out to them directly. 3 weeks after that, Andrew's phone rang. No caller ID. The voice on the other end sounded older, worn thin, and tired. But for anyone who had listened to the old coast-to-coast recordings, there was no mistaking it. The man identified himself as Mike Marcum. He said he'd heard they found his box, and he asked whether he could come by and explain everything. He showed up at the Carter farmhouse on a bitter October evening, 59 years old, precisely the age he ought to have been had his life unfolded normally since 1997, and yet somehow he appeared even older than that. Not merely aged, but hollowed out, worn down in a way that went beyond the physical, as though something unseen had been gradually stripped away from him, something invisible, yet fundamental to who he was as a person. Over the following several hours, seated around their kitchen table, he walked them through what he insisted had truly taken place. And what he laid out was nothing like time travel. It was something considerably stranger and far more unsettling. He said the machine never moved him forward or backward through time at all. Instead, it desynchronized him. That was the exact word he chose. He explained that he stayed within the same world, the same locations, the same unfolding of events, but shifted out of alignment with everyone around him, like a radio dial turned just slightly away from the signal. The music still reaches you, but it's distant, blurred, impossible to quite grasp. He recounted the night everything went wrong in March of 1997. The third-generation machine had finally stabilized, the field held for the first time, not flickering or surging, but steady and sustained. In a moment of reckless and absolute certainty, Mike stepped fully into it. There was no gateway, no burst of light, no feeling of rushing through time, only a deep and nauseating stillness, as if the whole world had quietly slid a fraction to one side and left him standing where it had just been. When he came back out, several hours had elapsed. The machine had overheated badly. The garage went up in flames. Mike made it out through the rear of the structure before it came down entirely. But when he attempted to return to his ordinary life, something was fundamentally off. People who knew him recognized his face, yet couldn't place his name. His landlord recalled having a tenant, but couldn't connect that memory to Mike in any concrete way. Phone calls wouldn't go through properly. Documents became tangled and difficult. Conversations seemed to dissolve from people's awareness almost the moment they concluded. People would speak with him, respond to his words, engage with him completely in the moment, and then forget the whole encounter within a few hours. Mike explained to the Carters that he hadn't vanished. He had become something difficult to perceive, difficult to hold on to, as though the human mind could register his existence in real time, but couldn't lock it into lasting memory. He was visible but impossible to retain, present but somehow temporary, a face that faded the instant you turned away. And every time he went back to the machine, trying to make sense of what had gone wrong, trying to undo it, the problem deepened. With each additional exposure, he became a little less real to the people around him, a little harder to recall, a little simpler to let slip away. He drifted along the margins of ordinary life for 25 years, under the table work, short-term rooms, places where nobody kept records and nobody would notice if they'd forgotten him by the following morning. He kept on studying the field, kept sharpening his grasp of what had occurred, and the conclusion he arrived at filled him with dread. It had never been about time at all. It was about perception, memory, observation, the delicate mechanism through which conscious beings confirm that another person is truly there. Mike came to believe the machine had severed that connection, not inside other people's minds exactly, but in the way reality itself registered his presence. He had been knocked free from whatever underlying layer makes a person perceivable, rememberable, real. A person isn't just a body. A person is a pattern held alive inside other minds, a web of memories, associations, and recognitions, the accumulated weight of every encounter that quietly affirms, this person exists, this person matters, this person was here. Mike believed the machine had damaged his capacity to generate that pattern. He could still be seen, he could still be heard. The impression he left behind vanished almost at once, like ink traced across the surface of still water. When the Carters asked why he had chosen to return now, Mike said he was running low on time. Not clock time, but memorable time. He believed that before long, he would become entirely impossible to hold on to. Present but undetected, alive yet beyond what the human mind could retain, a living ghost drifting through a world that would continuously forget he existed. Before stepping away, he made 3 requests of them. Send the journals to a private research archive. Keep the attic locked because certain equipment he had stored up there remained magnetically active, and never attempt to reach out to him again. Then he rose from his seat, walked out through the front door, and vanished into the cool October darkness. On the matter of memory, this is the part Andrew and Melanie Carter say they still cannot fully account for. The instant Mike walked out of the house, they had to actively concentrate just to recall his face. Not the following day, not the next morning. His features started slipping away immediately, like water escaping through open palms. The color of his jacket, the shape of his hands, the precise sound of his voice, the rhythm and cadence that had filled their kitchen for hours. Melanie snatched up a notepad and wrote as quickly as she could because she could feel the recollection coming apart even while it was still fresh, not fading the way ordinary memories fade, gradually across weeks and months, but dissolving actively as though something was drawing the information clean out of her mind right as it was happening. Andrew stood there in the kitchen, struggling to bring back the voice of the man who had been seated just across from him less than an hour earlier. He could not do it. He could recall that the man had spoken. He could recall the substance of everything that was said. But the sensory experience of actually hearing that voice, the texture, the tone, the particular quality of it, was already completely gone. Within an hour, they were looking at their own handwritten pages as though someone else entirely had produced them. The handwriting was familiar. The paper was familiar. They spotted the coffee stain in the corner and recalled knocking the cup over mid-conversation. But the living memory beneath those words, the felt sense of actually sitting in a room with another human being and taking in what he said, had already started to fade into something that felt less like personal experience and more like something they'd heard secondhand. By the end of the week, they needed those notes just to piece the conversation back together at all. Without that written record, they genuinely could not have told you with any confidence that someone had come to their home that evening. Years on, they described the encounter as something like a film they'd caught late one night and could barely pull back to mind. They know it was real because the evidence is still there. The journals, the Polaroid, the circuit boards, their own words in their own hand. But the actual experience of sitting across a kitchen table from Mike Marcum, hearing his voice, looking at his face, is almost entirely gone now. That, as Mike himself described it, is what he called unmemory. Not ordinary forgetting, but something that goes far deeper, a gradual erasure of a person's presence from the awareness of everyone who had contact with them. And all the while, the physical traces of that person remain sitting out in the open. The objects persist. The person quietly dissolves. What makes a person real? That is exactly why the Mike Marcum case isn't truly a story about time travel at all. It points towards something considerably more unsettling than that. What makes a person real? Is it their physical form, their name, their paper trail through official records? Or is it something else entirely? The capacity of other people to perceive them, to hold them in mind, and to carry some trace of them forward into the future. Whether existence is a physical truth or something built together, a shared act that needs witnesses to keep it alive. Mike believed the machine had shattered that agreement. He did not pass away. He did not slip into another era. He simply became impossible to hold on to, a face nobody could describe once they had looked at it, a voice nobody could replay once they had heard it, a name that dissolved the instant it left someone's lips, a living ghost drifting through a world that continuously forgot he was there. The Carters honored their word. The journals were delivered to a private archive. The attic was sealed shut. Since that time, only scattered, unverified sightings have surfaced. A man who looked like Mike, asking unusual questions in university physics departments, a conference attendee who gave his name, yet whom nobody could clearly recall afterward. A shelter resident with deep technical knowledge who slipped away before anyone learned much about him. Every sighting more doubtful than the one before it. Every witness less certain about what they had actually seen. Not because Mike was concealing himself, but because if his account is true, the world itself could no longer hold him clearly enough for anyone to be sure. Somewhere out there, Mike Marcum may still be moving through ordinary streets, standing in ordinary rooms, passing through lives that are unable to keep him, still breathing, still present, still reaching to leave enough traces behind before the last thread finally gives way. And even that evidence eventually stops being sufficient. The machine did function, just not in the way he had imagined. It did not master time. It did not unlock the past or hand him the future. It took away the single thing no person can endure losing, the capacity to remain real inside the minds of others. Mike Marcum never discovered a way to move through time. He slipped from memory's grasp, and reality made him pay the price.